A fashion media and communication with international magic present, Hyper Bodies, a summit on the
Role of bodies in a more than human world.
rival strategy, strategy in the body.
So it's a great pleasure for us to be here today. My name is Marta Ferreira, and I'm joined by my creative partner, Benedict Singleton, which you can see on the screen. We're really happy to be back and hopefully expand some of the conversations that we've been having with the cohorts from the course, and obviously incredibly lucky to follow the presentation we just had by International Magic. So both Ben and I are the founders of a firm called Rival Strategy. We founded Rival in 2016, and very much our organizing mission was to explore what contemporary strategy was and what it means in today's world and in many different fields. So when we were first invited to provide this talk, we had quite a few reflections, but for us, the thing that seemed most interesting for us also to explore as a practice was the relationship between strategy and the body, and what that might mean for everyone's individual practice, but also what that will mean for our relationship with an environment. Before we go into some of the considerations or some of the reflections that emerge from the preparation to this talk, we always like to start by actually providing a very simple definition from our point of view of what we mean when we say strategy. And for us, to put it quite simply, is defining strategy as the pursuit of a position of advantage. And obviously, this isn't necessarily new nor novel. For us at Rival, and in the context of today's talk, the two very important words there, or the ones that we feel relate to our question in terms of strategy and body, are perhaps not the one that most people will expect or tend to focus on, that being advantage, but it's actually the beginning, which is both the pursuit and the position. And we'll come back to it in a few slides and a bit later down the talk. But if we focus on both the pursuit and the position as nouns, as verbs, and as actions, for us, the question that really emerges is then, how does the body relate to strategy? And actually, through the history, evolution of strategy, and through people working in strategy, they actually seem to have very little to do with one another. Or at least there doesn't seem to be as much reflection in practice in terms of actually exploring how does the body get involved in strategy. So when people often think of those strategic questions, the body is almost a collateral. So it's not necessarily the starting point, it's not necessarily a condition of strategy, but perhaps just seen as a result or as an outcome. So today, we really want to explore some of these questions with you. A lot of them are not necessarily questions that we have answers to, so hopefully we can cover that through the discussion that will come at the end too. So as a starting point for us, the question, and Ben will take us a bit more through this, is how can strategy involve the body? And now let's see how technology works. Ben?
Yeah. So, can you hear me okay? Cool. Yeah, so what we will see here is I guess the process of our good intentions to talk about strategy and the body unraveling a bit, but we thought we'd just kind of follow the logic which was there in kind of our internal discussions. So yeah, in thinking of how can the body end up being involved in strategy, we were thinking okay, so I mean, there's a very direct relationship in that, like, you know, any given strategy to do anything like has its beginning in some kind of body. It's also the body is like an ultimate reference point for it. Even the simplest kind of strategies, just like surviving the night, like ultimately kind of point back towards the body. And like at the minimum, like, so we're talking about, you know, someone actually physically enacting some sort of strategy. Marta, can we move on? Hello? Yeah, so we began this process by thinking like, okay, then there's no sort of stock answer to like how, like what is the relationship between strategy and the body. So we were kind of like looking through our files. Like we've ended up building up like quite a big library of kind of the culture strategy, and especially the visual culture strategy, which I guess is like a sort of like after echo of our background in design. And oh, lost screen.
Yeah, just trying. I know. Just continue, Ben.
Yeah. So if we go to the next slide. So there are a lot of things here. There's like really obvious ways in which the body can be involved in strategy. Things like how, like, what do intimidation displays look like? How can you use the body as, like, in order to like impress an effect on the external environment in a really obvious and straightforward way? This is an image from, I guess, the early, well, yeah, maybe the early 2010s when like Mexican and South American cartels started using sources like YouTube a lot to kind of like project images of force in various ways, like across on media platforms. And next one, sorry, this is going to be a little clunky in terms of like going through the slides. And we also thought about like, okay, so there's actually quite distinct bodies of work, especially from the military and from like intelligence agencies and so on, about like how the body is used in a really minimal way to do things like deceive other people and so on. So the kind of common thread here, or at least one of the common threads, being while a lot of discussion about the body with respect to things like, you know, AI and world building and so on at the moment, and like big strategic questions about how we relate to these technologies, is very much about the kind of unconscious bias and being hard coded into machines, and producing like sort of like the political aspects of that. Like we were thinking like, okay, so there's something interesting to be said here potentially about like actually the very intentional, you know, cultivation of effect and of the manipulation of like what appears and what doesn't appear at any given time. And more broadly, like how this is being used. So can we move on? And this is like becoming something which is incorporated in like really public and visible ways at the highest levels of kind of geopolitical strategy. So here's Zelensky on his kind of like nation shaming tour by Zoom to solicit support for the Ukrainian resistance to the Russian genocide. And this all seemed like quite sort of like high level and abstract. And we were also thinking at the same time, like, how does this sort of permeate everyday life? So for example, in like techwear aesthetics, which really take on sort of like transform like general global instability into a sort of like strong tactical, at least vibe, right? Like the sort of readiness for any given circumstance. So we were going through these different things and thinking about like, okay, this is really about the role of the body in the strategic imagination and how we kind of like imagine the world around us and how we fit into it. But the more that we sort of like looked through these examples, which very directly related to the body, the more we kind of thought like, well, there are kind of underlying questions here which we're not really addressing, and perhaps we should talk about those instead, like rather than the very sort of like aesthetic and superficial layer of how the body relates to strategy. Maybe we should talk about like how the bodies actually actively get involved in strategy, which is one way of posing the question, like, who does strategy belong to and how do people fit into the process of like making strategies?
Yeah, so for us, the question of who does strategy belong to, or who gets to strategize about what and when, has always been quite pertinent to our practice and also as an evolving internal project of Rival. And part of that for us has been to look at the visual vocabulary of strategy and how strategy has been represented over time and across medium. And one thing that seems to be quite present even in today's representations of strategy is something that could be defined as high strategy and its tropes. So quite often, if even to the day, if many of us close our eyes and think of strategy, the image that might emerge is something that resembles this image of Dr. Strangelove, where strategy happens in a center of power, which might actually be a circular table that no one has. And it might be identified with what at the time and still at present might be white middle-aged men talking about power and what to do next. And this is definitely a metaphor, an analogy that we've even encountered through our practice, positioning ourselves as a strategy firm and as a strategy company. A lot of the associations that we get and a lot of the analogies that we could make and people have made is seeing a vision of strategy as elite thinking. And that vision is obviously just perpetuated by these type of images and representation in film, literature, and just social media as well. Obviously for us, what we mean by who gets to strategize what and when is really trying to look beyond that. However, we'll be foolish not to reflect on the history of strategy itself, and again, like when we look at visual vocabulary of strategy. And part of that and what we have on screen being the escalation ladder created by Kant, and actually as a type of world building as well, and simulation and scenario creation. And obviously the origin of strategy and strategos and stratagen being deeply connected and emerging from the military. So if these are some of the images and vocabulary that has been created, how has it evolved over time and what does that mean for us? Not very too dissimilar from Kant, or actually quite dissimilar if we look at the body. We also have Cummings as an example of someone whose project had obviously quite strong dependencies. And playing with people's prejudice to leave the European Union was meant to result in the UK striking an amazing deal. Obviously, I think now we all know what happened, both to that project, but also to the individual. So for us, like, there's something quite powerful in understanding the differences between these images, but obviously, like, for the purpose of today's talk, understanding the role of the body and how it relates to an environment. Building on that, something that has always quite fascinated us, and a series that we often talked about at Rival when looking at strategy and strategic thinking, is obviously the show Succession, where we have almost like a gyre, a large system of plots and deceit rotating around the core of a family. In this case, the family obviously being also inspired by the Murdochs and what that means for strategy at large. So if these are a lot of the images that have been fed to us, and obviously if we look even at current film, literature and novels, there's obviously no shortage of attention to strategy, and it is a medium that seems to attract a lot of investment in that sense. At the same time, it's perhaps not the best representation of the types of strategy that we need to develop or that we need to explore. And for us, like when reflecting on what we might refer to as these connotations and these visions of I strategy, some of the challenges or the pitfalls and shortcomings that might be encountered is the perpetuation of an image where strategy just belongs to a very particular kind of body and other bodies are just material. At the same time, they are a representation for the love of the counterfactual and the counterintuitive and the plot and the drama to a degree. There's an overconfidence in the plans and the dependencies that are generated or that are strategized upon. But maybe like as this means of reflection and summarizing what we're trying to convey, there seems to be an attraction for what's absurd, for violence and comedy at the same time in a few of these examples that we've looked at, which obviously everyone might like them as if nothing else as entertainment. But for us as a practice, the question that we started to explore is what sort of strategies need to emerge and that we need to produce as a response to today's environment. And at present, even though there's fascinating projects and initiatives at the moment, something that we've encountered is that the people and the groups, the collectives that seem to be doing some of the most interesting and promising projects are currently quite far away from strategy. So our take here is like, how do we identify with those? Hence for us introducing contemporary strategy. And 2 points or two components there that seem pertinent are the exploration of content and form. And by content, we mean the technology, the political situation, a lot of the levers that might be present in an environment, in a context, in a space. And form being actually how the present relates to the future and to the past to a degree, and how commitments are actually made and distributed. One of the questions here is how might we be able to preserve the content while still changing the form? So how can we deal and respond to some of the large social, political, and technology issues of our time without repeating the type of behavior that has put us in this position and without its obvious and well understood shortcomings by now? So again, like almost if we go back to some of the examples of Succession and even Dr. Strangelove, there's almost a representation of power, of strategy around how it relates to a source of power and how that is distributed. And obviously, this is again one of the points where we connect the role of the body and the role of collective in that definition. So if we go back to that initial definition of strategy as being the pursuit of a position of advantage, again, you'll remember that we said the two most interesting elements there for us are both the pursuit and the position. And part of why we find them the most interesting and promising, to be honest, as someone working in the field, is because both of them, or the response to both of them, requires commitment. And that's quite often what's lacking in existing projects, or that's quite often also the differentiation between strategizing and coming up with a plan and strategy in its own right, is understanding commitments as the ultimate currency of strategy. So what are some of the things that we are currently perhaps committed to, or that we feel that collectively we could commit more to? Ben?
Yeah. Hey, so as Marta says, like, what are some of the things that we're currently committed to? So we thought that we would like sketch out here some kind of emerging principles from across a lot of different kinds of projects in different contexts that we've been working on over the last kind of year or two. Don't know how successful this will be because it's the first time that we're kind of like airing a lot of this work in public, but let's find out. I guess we have time to discuss later. So the first of these principles is exit zero-sum situations. Anything that offers a way around a deadlock zero-sum situation offers hope for the future. And what we mean here is that there are an awful lot of situations which one can find on Twitter or in the pages of the press or in everyday conversation where like the situation itself is kind of like deadlocked between two sides, right? So you have something like either we can have online privacy or we can have data for machine learning at large scale, or either like people can have music for free, or like artists are actually able, music artists are actually able to afford to eat and so on. And what we find intriguing is when technologies arise like NFTs, zero knowledge proofs, mixed nets, and so on in those cases, which like enable us to reset the terms of like the terms of the discussion. So to slightly anticipate something we'll talk about in a second, like a good example is like either we can have lots of people involved in decision making, or we can make decisions quickly and accurately. And that's, if you look at something like the Polis the Pol.is platform, or the work that the group Radical Exchange are doing at the moment, like actually maybe that sort of zero-sum situation, that trade-off is not true. And actually maybe you can use things like machine learning algorithms to enable very large amounts of people to make decisions together much more quickly than individuals or small groups might be able to do. So we'll come back to that example, but the next and related principle here is to seek out forks. So I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the term fork. It kind of came to prominence around sort of crypto and Web3, where a fork would be used to describe like a point where a project breaks in half. So you have Ethereum, and then the next day you have Ethereum and Ethereum Classic. They share a history up to a certain point, and then they diverge. We kind of see that forks in large-scale ecosystems are the most important places to be, like where effort can be applied, like where there are breakdowns in kind of like the ways that people expect the world to work, but not in sort of like theoretical ways, like in just concrete, organic, bottom-up ways. This image here came from one of the numerous projects we've done with artists and cultural institutions over the last few years. This one was with Furtherfield Digital Arts Collective in North London, where we were looking at forks in the art world, and in particular where artists working with advanced technologies were basically like moving completely outside of like the art industry as we currently know it. I mean, they were funding work in ways that didn't involve collectors and didn't involve large-scale institutions, didn't involve applying, spending a week applying for an EU grant for like €1,000 and things like that, because they were like creating links with other sources of funding, like tech companies and so on. I'm not saying this is perfect, but this is a thing that's happening. Where there are initiatives like Google AMI, which are like supporting early stage artists and so on. And this is a fork, like in the art industry. There's these are two separate art worlds that are like minimally coexisting, but one of them is just like diverging from the other in really profound ways. So the third one here, rethinking interaction across scales. Just to recall what we were saying before about Pol.as, Radical Exchange and groups like that, we feel that there's a strong place to think about like successors to the social network. as we currently understand it. And the commercial social networks built on Web 2 stacks are based on recommendation engines and advertising algorithms, which are driven by outrage, and actually by deadlock, by outrage that just perpetuates itself and doesn't resolve, right? But the interesting thing, if you look at quite different digital systems that are being developed that are based on participation at scale, is that they use algorithms in order to try to identify, consensus positions, or to find different opinion groups and make those visible, that, when you are acting in a particular way, you are within a particular opinion group. The example here about this mass coordination is from Twitch Plays Pokemon back in 2014. The idea that thousands of people could play a video game at the same time would seem absurd, but actually it was strangely effective. And likewise, we've seen in work that we've done with sort of governments, municipal bodies and things, actors like the Cida Madrid or the Icelandic Parliament that are building at scale participation systems that effectively have the reach of a fairly substantial social network, but are devoted to not to producing sort of ad tech worthy cycles of conversation that don't resolve, but directional collective coordination. The next one, this might sound like a little tedious in a way, and that's sort of the problem, is linking mission and measurement. Generally speaking, the world of large organizations is run by metrics, by measurement. And I think on a sort of societal level, we're extremely bad at this. So one of the things, because we create things like art galleries, national, international art galleries have very simplified metrics like footfall, for instance, right? If it's more popular, it's better because it's more public and so on. Which is, it's a reductionist take of what they're doing, but it's not a particularly persuasive way to link the proposed mission with how to measure it. Yeah, so instead we can look to other places that creative practices have used data and harnessed data to making arguments in public forums about the validity of particular justifications and so on. The image here is from forensic architecture, who many of you will know who've done this within architecture, but we're also seeing similar things growing up around, for example, regenerative agriculture, where people are organizing the mission of organizations around really detailed, low level and transparent, publicly visible sources of data. And the last one, and possibly the furthest away from everyday expectations or realities at the moment, is we're seeing one of the most interesting ways to engage more people in large scale strategic development of infrastructure, to be people designing systems that basically look after themselves. A good term here from Jacob Horn from Zora is hyperstructures, which he uses to describe a large-scale public infrastructure that has incentives built into it for people to look after it. So it becomes this a freestanding digital system that isn't owned by anyone, that can't be owned by anyone, and that people have low-level, basically financial incentives to keep looking after. This sounds very science fictional, but of course this is the way that things like Ethereum actually work. This is just a take on how that system works. And one area that we've been interested in recently is with our friends at NIM, who are building basically a new privacy layer for the internet with zero knowledge proofs and mixed nets if you're interested in these kinds of things. And basically considering this open source software that if you build a blockchain into it, will produce financial incentives for people to play the parts of nodes in keeping other people's data secure. So these are obviously pretty kind of like lofty ambitions, but it felt to us that when we were first considering like strategy in the body, like these very large scale ways to like include vast numbers of people in strategizing were really kind of absent, or maybe not absent, but like distributed implicitly across a lot of the conversations that we've had over the last few years. So what we've endeavored to do here is just to try to refine out some of them. Marta, is there anything you'd like to add, or should we hand over?
No, I guess like it's really when starting to look at hyperbodies, and I guess like the big question for these 2 days in terms of the role of the bodies in a more than human world. For us, what the call to action almost is, and something that we like to explore collectively, is what are some of these areas of strategic hope as we understand them, and what might be some of the activities that we can do across our practice to explore some of these. And as Ben was saying, like this is just a starting point of things that we've encountered and that we believe have that promise, and hopefully something that we can collectively explore. So just recapping, those being the zero-sum situations, seeking out, pursuing and producing forks within industries, forks within ecosystems, rethinking interaction and interactions across scales, and part of it might be developing and building on more decentralized systems and networks, and obviously what makes it happen and what ensures that continuity, being the link between mission and measurement, and the infrastructure that might be able to perpetuate and take care of itself and enable us to explore and act on a very different, provide different alternatives for the public and the private, and what that means for the individual, the collective, and our identities. So I think that's it for us from now. So thank you so much for having us. And yeah.